G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys AFL Fantasy Podcast. Today I'm riding solo and we're going to be talking drafts. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the very pointy end, the first round. Who are the top 10 players in AFL Fantasy Draft? Let's go!
Hodge has done it from nowhere. Lifting the goal from inside the 30. Sheed from the boundary. Dusty.
G'day and welcome again to the Ball Boys AFL Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter or X at Ball Boys Fantasy. And today, like we said, guys, we're going to be doing a show covered entirely into draft. And this season, 2025, I am hoping to do more draft content. It is an area of the game that I actually really enjoy. It's actually probably more my bread and butter than the classic scene because, as some of you may know, I come from a fantasy basketball background where the Ball Boys started as a fantasy basketball podcast, and we started 2 years ago covering AFL. We jumped straight into the classic content because it was probably more people watch. There's more content surrounding it. I was also just looking for something a little bit different. But really, the draft is where I have the most amount of experience when it comes to creating content. And one of my favorite things to do at the start of a preseason in fantasy basketball, but also now we're going to do this in AFL, is go through the pointy end of a draft. Now, often it is over worried about, the first pick is just as important as any other pick. The thing with the first pick of a draft, though, is you've got much further to fall than obviously your middle round picks because these guys are already usually pretty good. And with AFL specifically, one thing I've noticed is that the top players in each season the previous year are very rarely the top players the following season. If I compare and contrast to fantasy basketball, Nikola Jokic is going pick 1 or 2 basically every single year, and he is finishing pick 1 or 2 every single year. AFL fantasy, it's not the case. Tim English was the first pick consensus last season. Xerri Marshall was there, and he obviously was the top scorer, but Tim English fell right down, falling 14 points per game. So the simplicity of just taking last year's average and plonking them in and being the first players drafted, I think is not necessarily the best way of going about it in AFL fantasy. It is obviously something that we use to inform our decisions, but by no means is the player who averaged the best last year going to average the best this season. So I think there's more room to get it wrong in the top of your draft in AFL compared to basketball. So we're going to get into it. I'm going to go through 10 players in the order in which I would draft them, and I will explain my rationale. Now, there is a few caveats. Because there are so many different variations on leagues in terms of league size, captains on versus captains off. Do you have a flex position or a utility position, or are you doing the standard 3-5-1-3 or a 5-7-1-5? That makes a big difference in terms of how many positions you have to fill. In AFL fantasy, positional scarcity is much more relevant than a fantasy basketball sense because obviously your midfielders are going to score more than your forwards. Your defenders are going to score potentially different to your rucks. You're going to need a different amount of players in those positions. You need 7 midfielders. You only need 1 ruck. So the value of getting the midfielders, that if they both average 110, it's much more important to get that midfielder because you're going to have to fill 6 other positions or players in that position as well. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go along. This list that I've gotten on here is what I would consider, and again, you can educate me because this is my first dipping my toe in the water here, but I would say this is the standard, and I would love for there to become a bit more of a universal default league out there. If we can maybe work together as a community to try and come up with a default setting, that would be awesome because it would make my job a lot easier. But what I've done is I've gone the list today where we're going captains on, which definitely changes the first round a lot, in my opinion. So captains on. We're also doing, obviously this is a points league, so standard AFL scoring, no extra points for spoils or anything like that. We're also talking about a league where it is, I think this could work for either a 5-7-1-5 in terms of 5 defenders, 7 midfielders, 1 ruck, 5 forwards, or a 3 defenders, 5 midfielders, 1 ruck, 5 forwards. It's probably more relevant for the first in terms of a deeper league because I'm taking that positional scarcity a little bit more into account. Because when you have to fill out 5 forwards versus 3 forwards, it definitely changes the value of the top guys. So always remember that your league settings make a fairly sizable difference in terms of the rankings of these players and how they are compared to the rest of their position, and how valuable that position is compared to the other positions. So with all that in mind, let's go through the top players in AFL Fantasy. And at number 1, I am selecting Tristan Xerri. He is going to be the number 1 pick, I think, in the vast majority of cases. I think I would pick him number 1 in most leagues. If it was a standard points league where there was no utility and there was no captains on, it was captains off, I think there's an argument to make that another player could be there, either a defender or a forward could make that selection. But because we're going with the captain's on position, I think he has the highest scope to be by far and away the best averaging player in the comp. On the YouTube screen there, you guys will know that I have a projected average written there. At this stage of the year, it is January 1st, so there's still plenty of water to go under the bridge, but my projections, I like to give a range. So I see Tristan Xerri going somewhere between 108 at his lowest and 122 at his best. I think he can rival Brodie Grundy's best season of his career. I think Tristan Xerri has the capacity to do that. He obviously did something very similar to that in the second half of last year, and North Melbourne started to play a more contested style of footy, which coincided with Tristan Xerri playing a lot better. Now, his last 5 games, he averaged like with a 140 plus. Obviously, he's not going to do that. They were very favourable matchups. But I do think the increase in ruck contests that North Melbourne did over the course of the season could be something that we see continue because they did get some good praise from general AFL media that they looked better in that case. So to me, he's in that perfect age bracket as well. I think the tackling is sustainable. I think he's just that good of a tackler. The marks also started to increase in the second half of the year. Now, that might be because of some of the matchups potentially, but I don't see him going back further down than the 108 that he averaged he averaged basically 105 in the first half. I think he can improve on that at the worst, but as high as 122, which is what he did in the second half of last season, I think he can do, which basically means that his median average outcome is about 115, and in a captain's league, that is extremely, extremely valuable. Obviously, you could put a C on that most weeks. The next player is the other ruckman at the top there, and it is Xerri Marshall. Now, again, if this was not a captain's league, if you did not have captains, I would probably actually put Xerri Marshall right down to probably pick 5 or 6. But because of the potential for him to be a 118 plus guy again this season, there's no major changes in the ruck department. However, the reason I've got him falling behind Tristan Xerri is I think they obviously have shown tendencies in the past to want him play him a little bit more forward, which he did do last season. They've also added some players that are just going to take bigger pieces out of the pie. And Xerri Marshall is not a player that averages a lot through contested footy. He's not a Tristan Xerri, he's not a Max Gawn, he's not a Brodie Grundy. He gets his around the ground a little bit more than some of those guys. So despite them not being ruckmen, Philippou playing more in the midfield, Jack McRae coming across, could potentially just take a little bit off Xerri Marshall in terms of his disposals, in terms of his marks, those kind of things that he does use to get his scoring. So I see his downside being about the same as a Tristan Xerri, but I don't think his upside is higher than what he did last year. I think last year is basically the ceiling for him. I don't think he can get any better. I do think that he has a chance to drop down. So but he's still done it 2 years in a row. He's an incredible scoring ruck, and we've seen this and seen the potential in this for years. So I am a big fan of him as a player. I just think that when you're comparing the 2 rucks at the top, I would go Tristan Xerri first at this stage. This is where I might start to break away from, and again, it's early. A lot of people might change their minds, but I think this might be a little bit of a surprise for some people. But I'm going to go Harry Sheezel at number 3. He is a player who had a very fascinating season last year. He, in the first 7 games, averaged 125 points playing off that halfback role. Then he moved into a forward mid-role for a large majority of the season. Now, a lot of people might be concerned about him dropping off because of him playing more of that role. The thing that makes me optimistic is there was a lot of playing around with his role, and when I said he moved to a forward mid-role, that was deliberate because he was a forward first and a mid-second for a large proportion of the season last year. In the games where he played more than 50% CBAs, he averaged very, very well. In fact, I'm going to pull it up right here. I did have a stat on this. So in games where he averaged 40 or more percent CBAs, in fact, he averaged 113.6, which was a 9-game sample size, and he did that on 84% time on ground. So that's where I've gotten my ceiling average of 114, because he did that last year. And 40% or more CBAs, I expect him to get that basically every single game. In fact, it could be higher. So I think the 106 average, which is basically what he did from the point of round 7 onwards, is his floor. And his ceiling is that 114. So I think that's actually semi-conservative. He's by far the most important player at North Melbourne. I can see them improving, and it's going to be off the back of him. So in a captain's off league, there is a very strong argument to say that Xerri Marshall should be the number 1 overall pick, even ahead of someone like a Tristan Xerri, even despite the fact that I think Tristan Xerri is going to average more. The positional value of a Xerri Marshall is higher because you're going to need to draft. I mean, there's going to be at least, 30 defenders drafted before you even get to your bench. So in a shallower league, you're going to get 40 defenders drafted, for example. In a 5-7-1-5 league, you're going to get 60 defenders drafted because you're going to have 5 on your field. Most people are going to draft 1 onto their bench. So you have to draft 60 defenders. His 110 average compared to a waiver wire acquisition of a defender is a much bigger difference, in my opinion, than when you're drafting, say, the rucks. And usually not everyone drafts a ruck on their bench, for example, as well. So the difference between a waiver wire ruck and Tristan Xerri, I actually think is going to be less. So there's a strong argument for Xerri Marshall to be number 1 in captains off. This list is a captain's on league, and he is just going to drop down because of that, because I don't think his captain scores are going to be counting for as much as the 2 ruckmen. But there is definitely a world, and I would listen to an argument with him going ahead of a Xerri Marshall, even in a captain's on league. This is where I will start a bit of a run of midfielders, because at number 4, I'm going to go with Zach Merrett. I just think he's the most consistent averaging midfielder in the game. Again, at this point, you're wanting basically people that are not going to let you down. And Zach Merrett, I believe, is not going to let you down. He's averaged between 107 and 113 basically every single season for the past, I want to say, 5 years in a row. So I think he's a pretty much a walk-up 110 guy. Very safe captain option. And at my first round, I'm basically just looking for a guy that's not going to shit the bed. I'm not trying to take home run swings. I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting a guy who is going to be very good. And again, the midfielders, you're going to draft a lot of them. However, there are also a lot of decent midfielders. So compared to his 110 average to Sheasel's 110 average, I think 110 in the defensive line is more valuable. Hence why I've got some of these mids behind him. But the next guy, again, similar kind of vein, similar thought process. Andrew Brayshaw is at my number 5. He is a player that I think is going to bounce back in a big way. The previous 2 seasons to last year, he was 110 plus. Last season, he had a slightly down year, averaging, what did he average? He averaged 105. A lot of that was due to the fact that they messed around with his role in the beginning of the season, played him a bit more out on a wing. But in the games that he played 60% or more CBAs, which is, again, is what I expect him to do this season, he did average 110. That was last year. So you've got last year's example of 110 plus, the 2 previous years' example of 110 plus. I see him as a very tight 108 to 112 average. Basically, he's a 110 guy. He has fought through some injuries in the past, some little niggles, which you could also argue makes his ceiling a little bit higher than what I've said here at 112. Maybe he could get up to a 114, 115 average. It's possible. I think conservatively, a 110 guy with very little downside, in my opinion, places him at number 5 for me. The next midfielder on my list is Errol Goulden. Some people have I've seen the argument of him going at number 1 in terms of the mids. He just falls behind those other two guys because I don't like his role as much. He plays more of the wing. You're going to see potentially some more Callum Mills in the middle. Maybe you've got a new coach, a few other just little variables. However, he scores well regardless. So in games where he played less than 40% CBAs, he was a 107.5 average. So that's kind of his floor. And he did that on 90% time on ground. And when he averaged more than 40% CBAs, he averaged 113.4. So that's his range basically there. And that was on 88% time on ground. So we've got good sample size in both those games as well. So basically, either role, I can see him doing really, really well. He's just an accumulator. I don't think Sydney are going to change too much. Let's not forget, I know they had a very disappointing grand final. They dominated most of the season. So I can't imagine that they're going to come in, despite having a new coach, come in and completely change everything. But there is a few other variables which just drops him down below those other two mids, in my opinion. He's still super young, still room to improve. And I love the fact that he's just out on the field a lot. So he is at number 6. And then the last of a midfielder run, I have Nick Dacos at number 7. Now, he is the lowest, I think outside of Brayshaw, the lowest averaging player on this list. He averaged 105 last season, but there's an injury-affected game in there, so if you take that out, his average comes up. And in games where he plays 60% or more CBAs, Nick Dacos averaged 108.5 over his last 2 seasons. So I think that's more about where he is. I also think the addition of someone like a Dan Houston actually helps a Nick Dacos. He is so far and away the obvious tag target in previous seasons. I think Dan Houston can take a little bit of the heat off him in that regard because he is also such a really good user. And I just think that his talent alone gets him right up there. I have no questions over his role. He's obviously right in that perfect age range, 23 years old. So you're not going to see any decline from that point of view. You still have the potential for him to improve. So again, I see him as a similar average to an Errol Goulden, that 107 to 113 bracket. He's just last in that group because I am saying a few ifs and or buts, there's a few things that need to go his way, and he will be he will get the attention from other teams, but I think he's good enough that he will punish the guys that don't tag him to make his average worthwhile enough to get in your side. So I have him at number 7. Then we depart from the midfielders, and I do go Lachie Whitfield. Again, we referenced the captains on, captains off discussion. I think in a captains off league, I would probably have him ahead of that group of midfielders, and I would pick him as high as number 4 in a league such as that. Even though I am projecting his 112 average last season to be his ceiling this season, I think it's more likely he's going to drop back to about 105, 107 type average. So I've got him at 102 to 107 predicted range. Over his last 36 games, which is the second half of previous year and last season, he has averaged 107, which is about when the Giants started to really take off. Remember they had that really poor start under the new coach, that first half of that season, but then since then they've been the Giants we expect to see now. And in that time, Lachie Whitfield's had a market share of the kick-ins. He's averaged 107. I think it's pretty safe to say that he's going to be about that mark, 112 being best case scenario. Factoring in maybe a little bit of injury potential with the 102 floor. So that's sort of where we get that average. But again, I have him as the second highest averaging defender. And I think that his role is extremely safe. He is someone that has ceiling. We saw the captain scores last season. I think it's fine to put a C on him. Despite being a slightly lower average than some of those midfielders, I still think he's definitely an option in really good matchups. This is where another curveball is going to come. And I can see some people disagreeing with this, and I'm not 100% sold on it yet, but I'm putting out a video on January 1st, and there's an argument I could even take this guy higher. But at number 9, I have Bailey Smith. He is clearly going to be the lowest average out of this top 10. He's a forward. I have his projected average being 88 to 102. And I think I'm being fairly conservative when I say that. So it's also a wider range. It's a 14-point range difference. I'm a big Bailey Smith fan when it comes to fantasy scoring. I think he has very high potential. His fitness levels is extremely high. He's also scored really well, more on a half wing inside role. And I think there's two possibilities that gets him way higher than this. He plays a higher percent of time inside and gets the CBA 70 plus. Geelong have not typically done that, but they've also not typically had very good midfielders. And I think he's walking into a side where he is going to be the number one guy, in my opinion. Or he has that high time on ground, which he has in the past, where he's done 105 plus. He's also had patches where he's gone 115 plus. There is a very real argument to me, especially in a captain's off league, that you draft him top 3. I think there's risk associated with that, no doubt. But if we look back after this season and he was the most valuable forward by 5 to 10 points, I think that is not going to shock me. The 88 average is if he's limited in terms of time on ground, maybe doesn't quite get that. So even with that factored in mind, he comes out in my projections as the number one averaging forward. And when you are comparing him to the 30 to 60 forwards that you're going to draft, he is by far and away so much further than a waiver wire pickup in the forward line than a lot of these other guys. So I've used this thing called positional value, which is basically a Z score comparing the standard deviation from the average of a position scoring to the projected average that I have here. And of every single player, Bailey Smith and Harry Sheezel are tied. Actually, Bailey Smith nudges Harry Sheezel out with a positional value of 2.19. So that's 2.1 Z scores higher than the average of their position. So in terms of if you're strictly drafting on positional value, he is the most valuable player according to my projections. Now, I've dropped him down to number 9 because I'm not 100% sold on my confidence in that. But I still think that he is definitely a first rounder for me, even in a captain's on league. Because if I'm drafting him at 9, when I get to my second round pick, I'm still very confident with some of the midfielders that I'm going to get in the second round, or even some of the ruckmen, that I'm going to get a good captain option. Now, he might not go this high. In fact, I'm pretty sure he won't go this high in most fantasy drafts. So if you get him in the second round, I actually think it's a massive steal. I would be wanting to lock away a captain score in the first 2 rounds, a captain option in the first 2 rounds. And then there's a bunch of forwards which they won't all make this top 10 list, but there is a bunch of forwards that I think need to be drafted in the first 2 to 3 rounds before the cliff comes and the confidence in those players really starts to drop off. So here's the top ranked forward, number 9 in my rankings here in a captain's points league. In a non-captain's league, I think you could take him in the top 5, top 4, maybe even top 3, in my opinion, because of his positional value. And I just think he's going to be the best forward in the game this season. At number 10, we're rounding it out with another start of a midfielder run, and it is Marcus Bontempelli. And by the way, I know Bailey Smith is playing for Geelong. The photo is just old on Google. Marcus Bontempelli, he is number 10, his ex-teammate Bailey Smith, that is. He was previously the second highest average in last season, dropping down to what did he average this past year? He averaged 107. I see him as a 106 to 112 type of average. Now, his season before that, I think he went 117. So there's a very outside possibility he has that as a chance, but I don't think it's realistic to expect. He is, in my opinion, the best player in the AFL. He has the most secure role nearly of any midfielder, except for the fact that sometimes he gets flung forward. However, I think with less options in the midfield these days than before, that's going to be less likely. You've also got more of a chance that someone like an Adam Treloar, who only missed 1 game this past season, maybe he misses more games this season. Libba is getting much older. Like he's, 33, 34 now. So Bont is going to continue to take a high market share in terms of fantasy point scoring. He is still, in my opinion, the best player in the AFL. He is 29 years of age, so I don't quite think we're hitting regression territory just yet, especially for someone as talented as him. So he's a very safe pick, I think, at number 10. And at number 10, you're obviously getting back-to-back picks. So you could pick Bontempelli and then go for a forward. If like a Bailey Smith comes your way and you can get a Bont and a Smith pairing, I think that's an awesome start to your draft. And in fact, in AFL Fantasy, I would much rather have a pick at the end of the first round than I would at the start, because those top picks are by no means guaranteed. The captains on makes that more of a debate, because obviously you're not getting quite that locked in captain, at least according to what we think is going to happen. But like we said, if you drafted Tim English last season expecting to have this awesome captain option every week, well, then you were very disappointed. So I don't think it's as locked in as, fantasy basketball is, for example. So I would rather have a pick towards the end of the first round if I had the choice. And at number 10, I do have the Bont. Let's talk about some honorable mentions. I thought I was going to do maybe the top 20. I won't do exactly them in order, but some honorable mentions and some players that you might be asking, where are these guys? Let's talk about them now. So the next player I would have been Jack Steele and Zach Butters were the two next midfielders in my projections. I just see them as super safe options where they're going to get a high market share of their team's points. They're both really good players, so they're not going to get moved out of those positions. Jack Steele has the runs on the board when it comes to year on year. He's at that average when he's not injured. Max Gawn is actually the highest projected average of all of these players. However, this season, I think there are a lot of rucks that are going to average 90, 95 plus. So when I have Max Gawn projected at 111 average, his 111 average to me is less important than getting someone as a forward who's going to average 95, or getting someone as a mid who's going to average 109, 108, because you're going to have to draft more of those mids. If you had a flex position, you could definitely, and I would probably argue to say Max Gawn should probably be in the top 10. I'd probably put him ahead of a Marcus Bontempelli and have him at number 10. But because of that positional value of the rucks, because I think the rucks are deeper than they have ever been, a lot of people are not going to go super early on their second ruck. So you can wait until there's 10 or 9 rucks off the board, and you're still going to be able to get a ruckman who's averaging nearly 95 points per game. And so the difference between getting a 95 ruckman and waiting and not picking that and getting another midfielder, because you're going to have to fill 5, 7 midfielders in your team, I think there's more likely a chance you're going to get a good ruckman late than you are going to be able to get a good midfielder, because there are going to be, if there's 10 people and they're all drafting 7 midfielders, well, you do the math. There's 70 midfielders. If you count down 70 mids in the rankings, it gets bad pretty quick. And there's a lot of question marks in terms of health, players just actually being in the team. Like, is Tom Mitchell going to be there? Is a Matt Crouch going to be there? What are we doing with these types of players who average similar to the rucks that you're getting, but their position in the team are not quite there? So Max Gawn is an interesting one. I also have Dylan Moore, who, again, it only takes a 90 plus for me to consider you at this sort of a spot. I think he's safe as houses when it comes to averaging 90 plus. He doesn't quite have the ceiling that I think a Bailey Smith does, so he didn't make the cut there. And Jordan Dawson. I think Jordan Dawson has the potential to be the number 1 averaging player in the game. I strongly believe that. In games where Dawson played, where was this stat? In games where he played 60% or more CBAs over the past 2 seasons, he's averaged 115.6. That is a 28-game sample size. So when this guy is playing pure midfield, he is 115, 116 averaging player. When he plays less than 60%, he has averaged 103.6 in non-injury affected games. That's a 16-game sample size. Now, his flexibility is the concern. So if we get word in the preseason that he is a midfielder, he is going to stay in that midfield and they're going to work everything else around him, then he vaults right up into that top 5 discussion, in my opinion. I'm not confident that that's going to happen. I think if I was coaching, he'd be in there. He'd be Marcus Bontempelli for me, and I'd be working everything else around it. I don't know if Adelaide are going to do that. I think they mess around with his role too much and have too many other issues on their team. So he's going to be moved around too much. But I do think that his ceiling is as high as nearly any other player in the comp. But he falls into the second round for me just because of that lack of confidence in his role. So some other players you might be wondering where they are. Tom Green. I've heard a lot of people talk about Tom Green being a potential number 1 averaging midfielder. I don't see that potential. Personally, I think he's going to improve, obviously. But over the past 2 seasons in non-injury affected games, which is a 45-game sample size, he averages 106, which is good. It's not great. I think he has potential to be better than that. He averaged 110, not last season, the year before in 2023. So I think that's kind of where we expect him to be, but I don't see the 113, 114, 115 season where I do see that with Brayshaw, with Bont even, where I see that with a Zach Merritt who's done that in the past. Errol Goulden, I think, can do that. I think Nick Dacos has that potential as well. I don't see that with Tom Green. So I think he's a very safe guy, probably a second, maybe even a third round guy in my projections, which might be a bit different to other people's thoughts. But he is someone that I think some of you might be thinking, hey, where is he? And Dane Zorko is the other guy who last season was 110 averaging player. I just think at 36 years old, just because he was healthy last season doesn't mean that that injury risk is gone. You're also welcoming back in Kitty Coleman into the side, who I think will dig into his points. I'm just not willing to take someone who's 36 years old at in the first round. I think he is more likely to me to be a late second, early third round player. I do think he's going to play the same role. Obviously, he was All-Australian in that role. They won the premiership. I don't think that's changing. However, I think that is absolutely his ceiling. And I do think he has a fair chunk of a floor below that, which makes the pick too risky for me in the first 2 rounds. I think there's a lot of other options which are just as good that I don't want to take on that risk in the first 2 rounds. So they're probably the players that you're wondering where the hell are they. Other forwards, Jack McRae, Philippou, Caleb Daniel, and Isaac Rankin, and Jason Horne-Francis. I could argue that all of them should go in the second round, because after that batch of players where I think can be 90 plus, I think there's a fair drop off after that. So the list I'm looking at here: Bailey Smith, Dylan Moore, Jason Horne-Francis, Jack McRae, Isaac Rankin, and Matthias Philippou. There's 6 forwards. I think after those 6 forwards, you've got at least a 5 to 7 to 8 point drop off in terms of their average, which is a fairly significant tier drop. So I would be wanting to get at least 1, preferably if I could get 2 in the first 3 rounds, I would be very, very happy and have my captain option. I think that's a brilliant start to your draft. You can worry about that last forward way later, because I don't think there's too much of a difference after those top 6 or 7 players. So for me, those forwards do come up fairly high because of my lack of confidence in the forwards after that group. So those guys there do make up the top of that list. So that is my top 10 plus a few other extras. Let me know down below what does your top 10 look like for AFL Fantasy Points Leagues? Is your league a captain's on, a captain's off? Do you have a utility or a flex position? I don't think the flex position changes too much in the top of the draft. Maybe that max score discussion does change a little bit, because then you can draft 2 rucks and have them on your field. So I think that's the one where it does change a few things. But a lot of the times you're still drafting 3 forwards, 3 defenders, or 5 forwards, 5 defenders. So you're still going to need to go pretty deep on those positions, and they dry up pretty quickly. So let us know down in the comment section below, what do you guys think about my list? Am I crazy for a few of these guys? Am I too high on Bailey Smith? Let me know down in the comment section below, and let me know what type of draft content you want to see from me over the next weeks and months leading up to the season. We have lots still to come. Our next video coming out, we'll be looking at defenders. Luke will be back on board, and we'll be talking classic and talking about premiums. And then the video after that, we'll be diving into some mid prices for classic, and then plenty more draft content still to come. So like, subscribe, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.